Hello, I'm Dr. Darya Shirokova, and today I am happy to present the third webinar of our new series, Houston, We Have a Solution, this time with Ann Ryan Robertson, who is the 2021 CIARB President and also now an independent US and international arbitrator. The title of our webinar today is very intriguing. It's called Renewable Energy Disputes, Old Wine in New Bottles. So let's start. So, Anne, you are the only native Houstonian I know, and let's talk about Houston a little bit more.
Well, first of all, I don't want to disabuse you, but I'm not a native Houstonian. I wish I were, but I was born in Huntsville, Texas, which is about 70 miles from Houston. And the way Houston continues to grow, maybe someday I can say I'm actually a native Houstonian. My parents moved here when I was 2, so I've never known any place else. And Houston has changed greatly over my lifetime. For example, I can remember when the 610 loop was built, and the 610 loop was considered one of the outer edges of Houston. And now we have the 610 loop, we have the Beltway 8, now we have the Grand Parkway, all of which are circling what is considered the greater Houston area. A lot of you have probably gone to the Galleria. Well, that was considered to be out in the sticks at one point in time. Westheimer was just a 2-lane road at one point in time. So all of these things have changed over the years. And I can remember as a child being taken to then it would have been the Humble Oil Company building, which was the tallest building downtown, to be able to look out and see the city. And of course now, well, we're seated in one of the tallest buildings in Houston because we're in the JP Morgan Chase building. So lots of changes over the years.
Thank you, Anne. A lot of people know you as a past CIARB President. So could you please tell us how you decided to do arbitration, whether you did some litigation before? So what was your path?
Well, like so many people, I first started as a trial attorney, and it was because of a particular trial that I was involved in that I actually ended up being interested in international arbitration. The client had been sued in an explosion case. There had been many, many deaths. The case was so large that there were actually 3 law firms representing the client. There were about 15 or so defendants, and there were many, many plaintiffs. We were the target defendant, and of course that meant everyone was shooting at us. And I ended up being the one who argued all the motions to the court. Ultimately, the client settled, and in the course of that settlement attempted to get insurance money and entered into a high-low agreement with one of the carriers, 20 versus 80 million, and agreed to arbitrate that case. Because of my role as being the person who had argued all the motions, and because the question was the settlement reasonable under the circumstances, I testified in that arbitration. And I was just amazed that 3 men were going to make the decision about whether or not the client was going to recover any monies or not. And I thought, I want to do this and I need to know more about it. So I actually stepped out of the practice of law for a while, went back, got an LLM in international economic law, began getting involved in the Chartered Institute, which you just mentioned, started going to conferences, and gradually worked into the international arbitration arena.
Thank you, Anne. So as the title of our webinar is Renewable Energy Disputes, we cannot not talk about the energy transition. So what's the energy transition for you? What's the definition?
Well, it's interesting that you say energy transition. Everyone talks about it now like it's some new concept. And actually, if you look at it historically, the idea of energy transition has been with us always. If you think back to the very beginning of man, the energy sources he had were his muscles and that of his beast of burden. And then man learned how to harness wind and solar, but in order to do that, still had to use its muscles and its beast of burden. And along about 1800s, we've come to coal. Again, how is the coal removed? Through brawn, through beast of burden. And then coal, of course, led to the ability to develop oil and gas. And the fossil fuels in turn, because they were a greater energy source, created the combustible engine, and then we had electricity. So the point I'm trying to make is that every energy transition has relied on energy sources that have been used previously, and that's the same for renewable energy. The fossil fuels are being utilized to smelt the metal that makes the wind turbines. So you always are depending on the previous energy source to create the new one, and each will always be interdependent. So when we talk about energy transition, I think what we really need to talk about is energy augmentation as opposed to necessarily transition.
And in view of all that, do you think that the energy transition disputes are really different from the classic energy disputes or classic traditional infrastructure disputes?
They have similarities and they do have differences. We have a well-developed oil and gas law, for instance, in joint ventures. You're going to find joint venture disputes in the renewable energy space. You're going to find fraud. We have a well-developed fraud claim law in the United States and in Texas. You have what we call greenwashing in renewable energy, where the party has misrepresented the fact that their product is environmentally correct, for instance. But then you're going to have different types of disputes as well, because you have differing regulatory systems, you have different policies that need to be taken into consideration. But at bottom, the types of cases that we've seen in the oil and gas industry will greatly inform the decisions of the renewable energy space as well.
Volt has been quite unpredictable place lately. And so what do you think, how do policy reversals or subsidy cut generate new arbitration? Which kind of arbitrations do they generate?
Well, when you're talking about policy changes, and goodness, you're right, we've had a lot of them. What comes to mind immediately are the cases that are referred to as the Spanish solar cases, where in fact the Spanish government backtracked on legislation that it had put in place, and it resulted in numerous claims being brought against Spain. And the investors have won in those cases. And those awards have been recognized and enforced almost in every country imaginable. But then you have to overlay that with what was happening in the EU, with the EU taking the position that the Energy Charter Treaty, which many of these claims were actually being brought on, was inapplicable and could not be utilized in intra-EU disputes. So this week, actually, because Spain has taken to the US Supreme Court its issue relating to whether or not it's entitled to sovereign immunity, this week the Supreme Court has requested that the US government, in fact, weigh in on whether or not Spain should be enjoying sovereign immunity and whether or not the doctrine of forum nonconvenience is available.
So I see that we have quite a lot of non-US lawyers as guests today. So could you please explain us what does it mean that the US Supreme Court asked the government? I've read personally that it's the Solicitor General, right, who should give the opinion. And the Solicitor General is sometimes called the 10th Justice. So could you please explain us the procedures so we understand what's going on?
From time to time, the Supreme Court will ask the government to provide a briefing on the government's position on a particular issue. Often they are issues that relate to questions of sovereignty. The reason they're called the 10th Justice is that in many, many cases, ultimately what the US Supreme Court decides is in accord with what has been suggested by the US government.
Thank you. So the next question, let's go a little bit into type of disputes we are having. So now it seems that we have more multi-party and supply chain disputes. So is it really familiar? Is it really due to the complexity of this large green energy ventures?
Well, we've always had those. We've always had those type of
Mhm.
disputes in the oil and gas industry as well. But I think what it highlights is a very important aspect of any dispute resolution regime, especially arbitration, is very dependent on the arbitration provision itself. Therefore, it's very dependent on the transactional lawyers getting it right to begin with.
Mhm.
So as a result, it's important that when you do have a supply chain, that the arbitration provisions match so that you can resolve everything in one place. And that's very important, especially in a global economy, because otherwise you may find yourself in some foreign court in one aspect, or you may find yourself in arbitration under another institution. So it's helpful if everything is in accord with everything else. And that's sometimes difficult to do, but it can be done. Meanwhile, you're seeing more and more consolidation and joinder in arbitration. Those concepts were not necessarily available even 10 years ago in arbitration, but the arbitration community itself and the institutions realized that this was something that was important if arbitration was to continue to be a very viable means of resolving disputes.
Thank you. I've also seen that we have quite a few students today as our guests, which is always great because we will, well, at least I like to educate people, and I'm sure Anne can share a lot of her experience as well. So could you please explain what are supply and chain disputes in the context of energy arbitrations or energy projects?
Well, sure, the supply chain is, it doesn't matter what industry you're in, it does, but it's basically one person has purchased something from someone else who are manufacturing something, which in turn is to be provided to another entity, which in turn is going to put that particular piece of equipment, for instance, into yet another piece of equipment and so forth and so on, all the way down to the finished product. And so you have your supply chain. And then at the finished product, part of that supply chain is actually the delivery of it to the end user as well. If any of that breaks down along the way, it has a domino effect.
And is it complicated for an arbitrator to see this kind of disputes?
It is not complicated if the arbitration provisions in each step along the way are identical, because the arbitrator then can consider each and every part of this domino that's occurred. But if you have it disjointed, yes, it becomes much more difficult.
And so coming from this question, another question comes to the mind. What proactive contractual means or instruments, what kind of clauses can party use in order to mitigate the risk of incompatible arbitration agreements, or even the risk of change of federal policies?
It all goes back to the drafting itself, so that the transactional lawyer needs to find out what are the dispute resolution provisions in the other contracts along the chain and try to make certain that they match. In terms of policy itself and policy changes, and we're already seeing this, is that you're finding more definitive definitions in the force majeure clauses as to what might constitute an element of force majeure. And so that aspect of the transactions are changing as we see more and more policy issues arising.
Does Texas law have force majeure provisions? Because for me, I'm originally a civil law lawyer, so for me, force majeure was always something like a French notion. Does the U.S.
Sure.
Texan law has it?
Sure, no, it's very well developed. It's accepted, absolutely accepted. Now, the courts will strictly construe force majeure clauses, which is another reason that you need to make certain that if it's policy change, what kind of policy change is going to trigger the force majeure. But yes, absolutely.
So kind of stepping away from your role as a Texas lawyer, do you think that Texas law is good for the potential new project in energy disputes for contracts?
Oh, absolutely. Texas has well-developed law in the energy space, well-developed contract law as well, well-developed fraud law. So all of that together means that if you have a dispute in the renewable energy space, the precedent is there to assist.
That's great. So coming from the applicable law to the applicable rules, institutions, and the seats, what do you think are, I can't say the best institutions because it always depends on the case, right? But what, in your opinion, are good institutions, the institutional rules to put into your contract? What are the good seats for the energy transition disputes to put into your contracts?
Well, of course, if you've got a treaty dispute, you're going to be an exit. If in fact you are going to have a commercial dispute, the ICDR, that's the International Center for Dispute Resolution, has a very robust set of rules, first of all, including one thing that no other institution has, as far as I know, and that is what is called a consolidation arbitrator. So if in fact you have two arbitrations and you feel that they should be combined in one, rather than the tribunal itself making that decision, because perhaps those arbitrators might have a vested interest, shall we say, in keeping the case, the ICDR will appoint a consolidation arbitrator who will make the determination as to whether or not the cases should be consolidated. It also, of course, makes reference to joinder, but one of the other things that the ICDR has is actually a panel of energy arbitrators that you can reach out to. In addition to the ICDR, of course, you have the ICC, you have Singapore, you have Hong Kong, and you have Stockholm. And those are the major ones.
Probably, as I said, as we have quite a few students, we should explain them that the place where the arbitral institution is located doesn't really reflect on the applicable law, right?
Well, it does not reflect on the applicable law, nor does it reflect on what institution that you choose. For example, you could have an ICDR arbitration, you could have it seated in France, and you could have the applicable law be the law of England and Wales, and that would be perfectly okay.
But we always we advise you to choose a Texas law for our energy projects.
Well, and I will tell you one interesting thing about Texas law as it relates to arbitration that you may not be aware of. We actually have two arbitration statutes. We have the domestic, which is chapter 171 of the Civil Practice and Remedies Code. And then we have chapter 172, and that is our international arbitration statute. And interestingly enough, it is modeled on the UNCITRAL model law. And there are only 7 states in the United States that have an international arbitration law that is modeled on the UNCITRAL.
And by the way, Houston Place of Arbitration LinkedIn page has a short post on that with the references to the laws, both international and local law. Thank you. And so the next question is, what role can Houston play as seat of arbitration for transition-related disputes?
I think Houston is a great place to seat an arbitration, especially if you're in the energy space, be it traditional or in renewable. We have extremely knowledgeable counsel here. We have extremely knowledgeable arbitrators. We have excellent experts from that particular field as well. In addition to that, we have wonderful space where you can hold arbitrations. The ICDR, AAA has space, JAMS has space. There's a variety of other buildings around town that are dedicated to dispute resolution where you can in fact rent rooms for arbitration. And then almost every one of the major law firms has excellent space that can be used by the parties for arbitration. So we have all the infrastructure that is needed for arbitration. And I might add, interestingly enough, I've been getting some calls recently from lawyers in Mexico, because as you know, they've changed the manner in which judges are elected in Mexico, and that's caused some consternation. And I've had a number of lawyers from Mexico call me about Houston and changing the seat in their contracts to Houston because they feel like it will be more favorable, wanting to know if we had any restrictions on foreign lawyers appearing in arbitration. We do not. And so it's a very arbitration-friendly place.
And I think that in one of the private talks, you told me that there are 145 different languages spoken in Houston.
Actually, we are among the most diverse cities in the United States. It's 145 or 146 different languages are spoken. The most prevalent, obviously, is English, followed by Spanish. And would you like to guess what the third is? Make a guess.
I don't think it's Russian though.
No, it's not Russian. It's Vietnamese.
Vietnamese, very interesting.
So, and as you can imagine, with all those different languages being spoken, the city itself is quite international in terms of opportunities, in terms of the food and the neighborhoods and the like. It's a very interesting place.
Thank you, Anne. So Houston is always, often and almost always described as energy capital of the world, right? And if you have ever driven to Houston, which I did, you see, all this energy infrastructure, old rigs, everything. But how does Houston evolve towards the energy transition, or it just keeps being this old traditional energy city?
Well, I'm going to give you some surprising statistics that you may not be aware of. First of all, yes, we have definitely met the renewable energy challenge here in Texas. Texas leads the nation in the creation of electricity through renewable means, and that is primarily done through wind. We are ahead of Iowa by quite a bit. And I think it's an interesting fact to know that the municipality of Houston, 100% of the electricity used by the city of Houston is green electricity. So yes, we're meeting the challenge.
I know that now many international oil and gas companies just moved, are headquartered here in Houston or operating from Houston. So what are the advantages of Houston as the hub for cross-border disputes, like international disputes, and cross-border energy projects as well?
Well, I think probably what you said addresses quite a bit of it. We have many oil companies and traditional oil companies, which I might add, even the traditional oil companies are reaching out and doing renewable energy projects as well. We've had Chevron and we've had ExxonMobil both move their headquarters here to Houston, and that speaks volumes about what a good place it is to do business. We have the port, which allows great exports, $180 billion, as I recall, this last year. All of this bodes well for cross-border transactions as well as cross-border disputes.
Well, I've heard that, I'm not sure about Chevron, but ExxonMobil has the low carbon solution company now, which is kind of separate. So, and I think that was published somewhere in Houston News, but they've been building some facilities for the carbon capture here in Texas. So it's true that we are just, even if Houston is sometimes, not by Anne, of course, but seen as an old energy town, it's changing dramatically. So talking about this renewable energy, new generation, which, as Anne said, it's not really new because wind has been here for quite a lot. What are the new types of disputes? What new types of disputes these energy developments bring?
Well, I think what you're going to see is there's going to be more policy volatility in disputes than you've had in the past. So that's going to be one thing that occurs. I mentioned greenwashing, which is, while it's fraud, it's going to have its own issues as well that may not have been present previously in the traditional oil and gas disputes. You're also going to have new regulations that you have to address, and you're going to have the questions of carbon trading and whether that's been addressed or not inappropriately. So you are going to have a new legislative framework that you didn't necessarily have in the traditional oil and gas. But we can't forget the traditional oil and gas also had its own regulatory framework, and we were able to navigate that. So we should be able to navigate the new one as it relates to renewable energy.
I think some of our listeners can have a question. Texas is traditionally presented as a red state, right? Republican state. Do you think it has some consequences for the energy transition, for the development of clean energy, or it just Texan being so business savvy that it doesn't really influence anything?
I would like to think it's the latter, and that the
Mm-hmm.
fact that we are a red state is not going to impact the ability to continue to be a leader in the energy space. And it certainly is nothing is indicating that we are losing ground as a leader in the energy space. And I might add that you have all of these companies that are moving in. We just talked about Chevron. We talked about ExxonMobil that are setting their headquarters here. Texas in general has always been a good place for business. We don't, the tax structure is good for business. And so I don't think the fact that we are necessarily a red state is going to have an impact on the ability to grow within that sector.
And I think Tesla has moved recently, right?
Oh yeah, Tesla's in Austin, yes, and there was.
But it's still in Texas.
It's still in Texas, but he's in Austin, and yes, there was an article, I think it was in the Wall Street Journal yesterday, talking about how many acres he has purchased in Texas for Tesla. So we have a lot of land, which is one of the reasons we're able to lead in the wind generation, is because we have wind farms way out in West Texas. It's, almost as far as the eye can see sometimes.
And by the way, a lot of parkings now here in Houston have the electric vehicle charging station.
Right. And
So,
and we also have the parking meters are now solar, so there's all sorts of things that have crept in over the years that you just kind of take for granted, but are actually examples of renewable energy being utilized.
And as you've been in Houston since the age of 2, now we will take advantage of you being a guest here. And can you tell us how did Houston change since you've been here? Do you see any changes? Do you see any difference?
Well, Houston has always been very welcoming to people from elsewhere, and so we've got a lot more people that have come down, particularly from some of the northern states. And I must admit, my dad was from Ohio. He wasn't a Texan. He came down after World War II and never left. I think most people who come here genuinely like Houston once they get here, and are no longer afraid to come. My dad tells the story, and remember, this is after World War II, that some of his family thought that there would be cowboys and Indians running around in Houston, Texas, or Texas in general. So I can assure you there are no cowboys and Indians running down the streets. But in terms of changes, obviously, we have many more buildings, gorgeous skyscrapers, wonderful architecture. We actually have 2 buildings by Philip Johnson that are on the opposite sides of the street from one another. So you can see one of his early buildings, which is mid buildings in his career, which was the Pennzoil, and then one towards the end of his life, which was called the Bank of America. And I'm not certain what it's called at this point. Two very different sides. And it's a very green place in terms of parks. A lot of people don't realize that, but of course it's gotten bigger. Where I live is about 10 miles outside of downtown, and I can remember 30 years ago at church, the preacher saying the projections were that where we lived was going to be the center of Houston and about this time. And it is the center of Houston now. It's moved. The medical center's gotten larger. Everything's gotten larger and bigger. That's how it's changed.
When people speak about Texas in general and development of Texas as a state, people speak about Galveston, people speak about Dallas. So it seems like Houston is newer than Galveston, or
I'm not certain when Galveston was established. Houston was actually established in 1836, when it was just kind of a marshy, malaria infested kind of place. Galveston, because it was right on the coast, developed into a very prominent seaport. Unfortunately, in 1900s, you may be aware of the hurricane that came through, which was the greatest natural disaster that the United States has ever experienced. It flattened the barrier island. Over 5,000 people were killed. And after that, there was questions about whether or not Galveston should really remain one of the main ports in Texas, and Houston saw it as an opportunity, and as some people say, dug a ditch to the sea, which in turn is our ship channel, which, as we talked about, $180 billion left out in exports this last year. It's one of the major ports in the United States. And I think it's a good example of Houston looking at a problem and finding a solution.
Great, because in Houston we have the solutions, right? We don't have problems.
That's right. We have Houston, we have the solution, yes.
Great. So, Anne, I know that, well, at least Anne has always brought me to wonderful places which I didn't know as not as a person who just a newcomer here, right? So, my favorite section of all my discussions, where would you bring people in Houston? Where would you bring foreign clients? Where you bring local clients? Where will you bring friends? Just tell us everything.
Well, I've always described Houston as not revealing her charms easily. And by that, I mean, if you just came in for a business trip and you only stayed one day, you'd just see concrete and traffic and not be very impressed with the city. If you have someone to show you around, I promise you your ideas about the city will change. I've taken clients to a number of different things. Of course, it depends on the client's interest. If they're here during rodeo, I take them to the rodeo, and they are always entranced by that. Some of them want to hear country western music, so we go looking for someplace where you can hear country western music. We have some fabulous museums here, one of which is the Manil, and that's a very interesting museum because it actually has its roots in the oil and gas industry, because Dominique Manil was a Schlumberger. And as you recall, you have Schlumberger is the company that came up with the seismic for the oil and gas. Schlumberger, and so she and her husband bought a lot of modern art and abstract art and various other types of art. They liked African art as well. It was all their private collection. And when she died, Houston got her collection. They built the Manil Museum, which was done by Rezo Piano. And it's a lovely space and it's free. The Museum of Fine Arts that we have here actually has more gallery space than most museums. In fact, it's the second largest in the Americas in terms of gallery space. And then I like to take people to Bayou Bend. Bayou Bend is a house that was built in 1927 by a woman named Ima Hogg, and yes, that truly was her name. And that house has one of the greatest collections of Americana furniture in the United States. So those are places that I've definitely taken clients. And also don't forget, we can't forget NASA. The word Houston was the first word spoken off the moon. So in terms of where to eat, I like to take clients to local places. One of my favorites is Good Company Seafood, because there you can get mesquite grilled seafood. And this summer I took about 12 people there. I took some Romanians, Uzbekistan, Russian, Italian, English. We were all around this table and everyone loved the food. In fact, the Romanian happened to say later that he thought the shrimp dish that he had ordered was the best thing he'd ever eaten in his life. Of course, it shows he has good taste because it was shrimp stuffed with cheese and jalapeno and wrapped in bacon and grilled over mesquite grill. Brennan's, which you and I have been to, is a sister to the Commander's Palace in New Orleans, and it's been in Houston since about the mid-60s, and I like to take clients there because it's a little bit of Creole and a little bit of Texas. If they're looking for Mexican food, true Mexican food, Mexico City type, Hugo's is popular, and I like to take people to Hugo's because it's an American success story, and perhaps more particularly a Texas success story, because Hugo came here as an illegal immigrant, and he now has about 5 or 6 restaurants throughout the city. If they want steak, Well, we have lots of steak places, but Taste of Texas is always a good place to take people because it's full of Texas memorabilia. So you can, after you finish eating your steak, you can wander around and learn a little Texas history. And I'd probably be remiss if I didn't mention also fajitas, meaning the original ninfas. And ninfas introduced Texas to fajitas, and now fajitas are bought and are available throughout the United States, but they're always better here in Houston.
Thank you so much, Anne. It seems like we have some questions, not necessarily on energy transition, but I guess very useful questions, which we will try to answer.
I hope I can.
I'm sure you can. So, first question from Daniel Kajovi. How accessible is training and continuing education in arbitration for young practitioners and enthusiasts in Houston?
Okay, so the question is how much training or how
accessible the training is.
How accessible the training is. Well,
Mhm.
I can put in a plug right now. I'm actually teaching a CLE course on arbitration on Friday and Saturday for the University of Houston. It's done once a year. Join us next year, please. It's done by Zoom. So that and it explores both domestic and international arbitration. There are a variety of other things that we have. The ADR section of the state bar often has something about arbitration, but if you want to really get some good training, you need to look into the Chartered Institute of Arbitrators. Go to their website, and in more particular, the North American branch website, I would suggest, because they offer training in arbitration, both in terms of lectures for the earliest stages, and then also if you're interested in ultimately becoming an arbitrator, the later training focuses on being an arbitrator.
And we also have, as Anne said, Anne is teaching at the University of Houston Law Center, and University of Houston has the LLM for foreign students. And one of our guests next year, not in 2025, but in 2026, there will be executive director of graduate programs at Houston University Law Center, Karen Jones. So please join us for that one. And I think she will explain about the training. And another question is about I understand that's the enforcement question, but I will read the question because it has also a lot of compliments to us, which I like to read.
Okay.
So, Pritam Dumbre. Actually, Pritam is our guest for, I think, second time for the webinar. So thank you so much, Pritam, for keeping up with us. My sincere compliments to Madam Robertson for her brilliant insights and Dr. Shirokova for her moderation. I would like to ask, an obvious issue with supply chain is the involvement of multiple entities at different levels, public and private, across different jurisdictions, in the same commercial agreement or transaction. So the question, should a dispute arise and matters be submitted to arbitration? How do we ensure compliance and enforcement by all these different actors whose national courts may not be as conducive to dispute resolution?
If I understand your question, my answer is going to be arbitration, first of all, and coordination of the various agreements. And in fact, if you want to make certain that there is not a disruption in the supply chain, in addition, it's possible to put in your agreements that if there's a dispute, you continue to supply whatever it is you're required to supply pending the outcome of the arbitration. And please remember that most arbitration institutions have expedited rules, and the parties can contract that if a dispute arises, that it will be done under the expedited rules. The expedited rules in most of the arbitration institutions require that the dispute be resolved within 6 months. So that is a vehicle that can be used. You're absolutely right. If you don't have arbitration provisions and you're in the courts around the world, you have a major problem.
Right. And also for the enforcement, you should find a seat of arbitration which is enforcement friendly. So for instance, Texas is a very friendly jurisdiction. And if you are having an arbitration with one of the companies having assets in Texas, so it will not be a problem.
Yeah, you need to, and when doing the arbitration provisions do look at, where you think you may need to enforce the award as well, and do some considerations of that. We're having, unfortunately, a bit of a balkanization of economics, as I call it, in that we have some countries that are backing away from the New York Convention, your home country being one, I'm sorry, Russia, with the laws that is enacted. So you need to be looking very carefully at where you may need to enforce your award. But even with those issues, it is still better than going to court. And you need to remember that, for instance, while there is entry in the EU, there is automatic enforcement of judgments within the EU between two EU countries. There is no treaty that requires any country to enforce a US judgment. As a practical matter, many are, but there is no treaty. You compare that to the New York Convention, which in essence does require recognition and enforcement, and that is one of the drivers for international arbitration.
Thank you so much. I don't see any other questions, so probably, oh, no, I do see one more question. Okay, so thank you so much for this insightful webinar. Given Houston's position as a global energy hub, do you see a shift in arbitral seats or governing law preferences for energy contracts away from the traditional European centers?
My answer to that is I certainly hope so. Texas is a great place and Houston is a great place for arbitration. I think that we are perhaps don't talk about it as much as we should. And that's one of the reasons that Darya has created what she has created here with Houston Place of Arbitration. But as I shared with you earlier, we have an international arbitration statute. We have excellent courts for purposes of enforcing international arbitration awards. The Fifth Circuit is very pro arbitration. All of that bodes extremely well for Texas, and more particularly Houston being an appropriate seat for arbitration, coupled with the fact, as we could discuss, we have a wonderful infrastructure here.
And as we have some of foreign lawyers here as our guests, could you please explain the Fifth Circuit? What is its role? What's the positioning of this court on the map of the U.S. court?
Sure. The United States, first of all, is divided into 11 circuits. And in those circuits, first of all, are what we call our district courts. And the district courts are federal, obviously. And then from the district court, if you're unhappy with a decision, and I'm talking about if you've tried a case, then you appeal to the Fifth Circuit. The Fifth Circuit is comprised of numerous judges. They typically sit as only 3, but on occasion you can request what is en banc, meaning it would be all the justices, and the judges will then rule on any appeals. If you're unhappy with what the Fifth Circuit has done, then you can take it to the United States Supreme Court. But the United States Supreme Court is not an appeal of right. You must petition with a writ of certiorari to ask the Supreme Court to take up your case. And the Supreme Court only takes a very, very small percentage of the cases. What that means is that in many instances, the Fifth Circuit is the last court that will rule on the claim that you brought.
Thank you, Ann. And to add on what Ann just said about this shift from European centers, European arbitral institutions, European cities as the hubs for energy arbitration, as Ann said, Texas has a very friendly and very, very developed energy law. Then Texas and Houston specifically has like a great choice of energy lawyers and arbitration lawyers and arbitrators, who Ann is, right? And also ICDR, as Ann said, has the special energy arbitrators panel. It's really has all the tools to cater to the energy arbitration. So yes, we do hope actually that it's not only there will be a shift, but that we have seen a shift already. So thank you so much, Anne. That was
Thank you for the
amazing,
invitation.
amazing discussion. I hope all our guests have learned a lot. I don't see any other questions, so I just want to thank you all for keeping up with us, for coming, listening, asking your questions, and I hope we will see you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.